Julie Jensen was born in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and was the only girl among her 6 brothers. Growing up in a devout Christian family, she experienced an abundance of love and support. She was known for her sweetness, fun personality, and exceptional talents. In the early 1980s, she met her future husband, Mark Jensen. The couple dated on and off throughout college, and after Mark graduated, he and Julie decided to marry. They tied the knot in the spring of 1984. After their wedding, Mark and Julie settled in the upscale neighborhood of Coral Beach in Pleasant Prairie, Wisconsin. Mark pursued a successful career in a prestigious stockbroker firm, while Julie also worked in finance as an administrative assistant at a brokerage. In 1990, Julie and Mark welcomed their first son, David. 5 years later, their second son, Douglas, joined the family. Mark was a driven and ambitious individual, although quiet by nature. Through hard work and dedication, he established himself as a reputable figure in the stock brokerage firm where he worked. On the other hand, Julie made the decision to stay at home and raise their sons after they were born. Being a devoted mother, she prioritized her children's well-being and dedicated herself to providing them with a nurturing environment. This decision allowed her to embrace the role of a homemaker and caregiver. Julie and Mark's relationship seemed picture perfect from the outside. They exuded warmth and affection towards each other, smiling and charming the neighborhood with their infectious laughter. Their love for each other seemed unbreakable, leaving everyone in awe. The Jensen family was the epitome of the all-American family. They lived in a beautiful house, had a successful career, and were blessed with 2 happy and healthy sons. Their frequent outdoor chores, such as gardening and yard maintenance, only added to the image of a perfect family, where everyone seemed to enjoy each other's company. However, appearances can be deceiving, and it was soon discovered that dark secrets lurked behind the surface of the Jensens' seemingly idyllic life. Julie and Mark were keeping secrets from the outside world, secrets that would ultimately cost Julie her life. As the truth came to light, it shattered the illusions the Jensen family had created. Neighbors who had been admiring their perfect partnership now found themselves questioning the facade they had witnessed. The truth about Julie and Mark's relationship would forever change the lives of those who knew them. On December 3, 1998, in the late afternoon, Mark Jensen called 911 to report that his wife Julie was not breathing. When the paramedics and police officers arrived at Julie and Mark's Pleasant Prairie home, they found her in bed, under the covers, and at first glance, she looked like she was sleeping. However, it soon became apparent to the first responders that Julie was beyond help. She was dead. As medics and police conducted a cursory glance around the room, they didn't identify any obvious cause of death to Julie. There were no gunshot wounds, knife wounds, or drug paraphernalia in the area that could explain how she died. Mark explained to the police officers that after he picked up their 8 and 3-year-old sons from school, he returned home to find Julie unresponsive. According to Mark, Julie had not been feeling well and struggled with her mental health lately. The officer saw a bottle of antidepressants prescribed to Julie on the kitchen counter. Mark, devastated by the loss of his wife, revealed to the police that he had been concerned about Julie's well-being due to the difficulties she was experiencing with sleeping and eating. His distress grew as he desperately sought to understand what had happened to Julie that led to her death. The district attorney arrived at Mark and Julie's home in Pleasant Prairie with the intention of investigating what had caused Julie's death. Upon entering their bedroom, the district attorney observed that the position of Julie's body seemed unnatural, leading him to suspect that foul play might have been involved. Therefore, he wanted crime scene investigators to search the residence thoroughly. However, the district attorney was unable to establish probable cause for a search warrant to be issued on Julie and Mark Jensen's home. Despite the lack of legal justification, the district attorney remained convinced that something suspicious had occurred to Julie Jensen. He found Mark being consoled by the police department's chaplain and informed him that to conduct a thorough death investigation, investigators needed to be called in, and Mark consented to the search. Crime scene investigators arrived at Julie and Mark's home and discovered a home computer. In 1998, computers were still considered a luxury and not commonly present in the homes of the general population. However, recognizing the potential value of the computer as evidence, the investigators decided to remove it from the house and bring it to the crime lab for forensic analysis. The district attorney recently learned from the local police department that they were familiar with Julie Jensen before her death. In fact, they knew her by first name. This information raised several questions for the district attorney, as he began to wonder if the harassment Julie had previously reported to the police had anything to do with her untimely death. As the district attorney learned more about Julie Jensen as he investigated her suspicious death, he saw she had kept a log of all the harassment she had received. Julie had been subjected to various forms of harassment for many years, ranging from minor incidents to more serious threats. Her log documented the various incidents she had encountered, providing a chronology of the escalating harassment she had experienced. Julie reported the level of harassment she received varied from her front porch furniture being rearranged to receiving explicit photos at her home. She even reported to the police that her husband, Mark, left X-rated images under the windshield wiper of his car at his office. The harassment tactics employed by her tormentors were diverse and unpredictable. Over the 7 years Julie and Mark lived in Pleasant Prairie, she contacted the police department dozens of times regarding the harassment. Despite her efforts to seek justice, the local police had limited resources and struggled to identify the perpetrator. Julie's repeated reports to the police went unanswered, leaving her frustrated and helpless. The small-town police department faced challenges in unraveling the harassment case and identifying the responsible party. Because the detectives working on the harassment case had a difficult time figuring out who the harassers were, they recommended to Julie that she and her husband Mark hire a private investigator. Frustrated with the limitations imposed by the police department, the detectives suggested a different approach. They advised Julie and her husband Mark to consider hiring a private investigator to assist with the investigation. By hiring a private investigator with additional resources and expertise, the detectives hoped to uncover the truth behind the harassment. The private investigator hired by Julie and Mark Jensen to investigate the harassment they were experiencing was a former police officer. During their initial meeting with Julie, the private investigator observed that the impact of the harassment was apparent. Julie exhibited signs of fear and concern for her and her family's safety. During their initial conversation, Julie disclosed to the private investigator that she had had a fling with a coworker named Perry Tarika several years prior. She expressed her belief that the person harassing her could potentially be Perry. Julie informed the private investigator that her husband Mark was fully aware of the incident with Perry. Julie expressed to the private investigator that she felt tremendous guilt about the incident. She was concerned that Perry may have returned to cause further problems for her and her husband, who were attempting to rebuild their lives with their 2 young sons. The private investigator acknowledged the severity of Julie's situation and assured her he would conduct a thorough investigation to uncover any leads or evidence related to Perry and the harassment. He assured her that he would take all necessary measures to ensure the safety of her family. Armed with Perry Tarsio's name as a potential suspect in the harassment, the private investigator delved into his background and discovered that he had recently moved from Wisconsin to North Carolina. This development raised suspicion, as Julie Jensen had mentioned the possibility of Perry traveling to Chicago and then driving back to Wisconsin to harass her. Despite the investigators' findings, Julie remained adamant that Perry was behind the harassment. Determined to uncover the truth, Julie Jensen hired a private investigator to conduct surveillance outside her husband Mark's office. The private investigator spent numerous hours observing the premises, particularly focusing on the possibility of anyone lurking nearby. However, despite sitting patiently for hours, the investigator witnessed no one suspicious. Several days later, Julie Jensen called the private investigator to express her desire to terminate the surveillance. Despite the lack of concrete evidence, Julie remained convinced that Perry was the culprit behind the harassment. In light of this information, the district attorney investigating Julie's suspicious death took a keen interest in this incident. 1 month into the investigation into the death of Julie Jensen, the district attorney received the results of the toxicology tests conducted during Julie's autopsy. To everyone's surprise, the tests revealed that Julie tested negative for all the common drugs and poisons. This development raised even more questions. To investigate this matter further, the district attorney requested the assistance of the crime lab's computer experts. They began studying the Jensen home computer, hoping to find clues that might shed light on what had transpired. To their astonishment, experts discovered that someone had been searching for drug interactions and positions, with a particular emphasis on ethylene glycol. Ethylene glycol, the main ingredient in antifreeze, is a highly toxic substance that can have fatal consequences if ingested. The district attorney immediately recognized the significance of these suspicious internet searches. He promptly asked the medical examiner to repeat the toxicology test on Julie's blood, but this time, he instructed them to search for ethylene glycol specifically. When the second round of tests came back, the district attorney's suspicions were confirmed. Traces of the deadly poison were found in Julie's system. Although the district attorney knew that Julie was poisoned, he did not have enough information to determine the manner of her death. Was it intentional, or was she murdered? While the district attorney investigated, he discovered that Julie had sought help from a family therapist in the early 1990s. The therapist diagnosed her with postpartum depression after her first son David was born. He prescribed her the antidepressant Paxil to help cope with the condition. This information raised questions about Julie's state of mind. Further, the district attorney discovered that on December 1st, several days before Julie's death, she had seen her doctor and stated she was feeling miserable, unhappy, and depressed. As a result, the doctor prescribed her Paxil again, as she was already taking a dosage for depression. However, during the conversation with the district attorney, the doctor disclosed that Julie had expressed to him that she did not intend to take her own life. Despite the doctor's reassurances, the district attorney recognized the possibility of people saying one thing and then doing the opposite. Yet the district attorney still believed that there was something amiss in the death of Julie, and believed that foul play was involved. There were several factors that led the district attorney to believe that Julie was murdered rather than taking her own life. Firstly, in cases where individuals intentionally commit suicide through ethylene glycol poisoning, it is common for evidence of the substance to be in close proximity to the victim's body. However, when investigators searched Julie and Mark Jensen's home following her demise, no traces of ethylene glycol were found. Moreover, the quantity of ethylene glycol in Julie's body was relatively low, raising suspicions. To the medical examiner, the amount of ethylene glycol in Julie's system revealed a pattern of ingestion over several days. The district attorney sought to determine if Perry Tarico, Julie's former lover and prime suspect in her harassment, had any involvement in her death as well. However, after the district attorney spoke to Perry's employer, it was confirmed that he was at work in North Carolina at the time Julie passed away. This alibi ruled out Perry as a potential suspect, and he was cleared from further involvement in the case. The district attorney began scrutinizing Mark Jensen, Julie's husband, as the prime suspect in her murder after uncovering a torrid email exchange between him and a woman named Kelly Labonte, an assistant at his brokerage firm. This discovery was made when the computer experts inspected the Jensen's home computer and stumbled upon the incriminating messages. Kelly, who was married and resided in St. Louis, initiated contact with Mark, and they began meeting secretly in St. Louis on several occasions before Julie's death. 4 months into the investigation into Julie's death, Mark and his eldest son David showed up at the Pleasant Prairie Police Department seeking updates. Mark, who was already the primary suspect at the time, presented a unique opportunity for the detective to interrogate him. Recognizing the heightened suspicion surrounding Mark, the detective decided to take advantage and asked him to follow him into an interrogation room. While Mark was being questioned, an officer remained with David to ensure his safety and well-being. During the interrogation, the detectives questioned Mark about his relationship with Kelly Labonte. Mark admittedly denied having any romantic involvement with Kelly, claiming they were just friends. However, the detective had in his possession the racy email exchange between Mark and Kelly. Additionally, the detective discovered that Mark had arranged to have Kelly, who had recently divorced her husband, move from St. Louis to his home in the small town of Pleasant Prairie, Wisconsin. This relocation, which took place weeks after Julie's death, raised even more questions about Mark's involvement. Furthermore, the detectives learned that Mark had disposed of 15 bags filled with Julie's belongings immediately after her death. This act of discarding his dead wife's belongings seemed highly suspicious. Despite the evidence presented, Mark continued to deny the accusations and maintained his innocence in Julie's death. However, the detective surprised Mark by revealing a letter written by Julie prior to her death and addressed to the police department. Julie's letter stated that if she died, Mark was the person who killed her. In the letter Julie addressed to the police department, she expressed her concerns about her husband Mark's behavior. She had discovered a note in Mark's business planner, which caught her attention due to its unexpected nature. The content of the note prompted Julie to believe that it was not something she was meant to see. This note mentioned words such as drug supply, razor blades, syringe, which raised her suspicions. Julie wrote in her letter to the police department that she sincerely hoped that she was wrong and nothing would happen to her. However, her growing concerns led her to fear for her safety and well-being. Before she died, Julie took the necessary steps to ensure that her concerns were addressed. She entrusted her neighbor with a letter she had written to the police department, instructing the neighbor to present it to the authorities if something happened to her, who gave it to the detective when Julie died in December 1998. During Mark's interview with the detective presented him with a copy of Julie's letter, which included a photo of the kill list, as it came to be known. The detective left Mark alone in the interrogation room, observing him through the two-way glass. The detective returned to the interrogation room determined to get Mark to confess to murdering his wife, Julie. However, Mark adamantly denied the claim, maintaining his innocence. Despite Mark's denials, the detective continued to push for a confession, even accusing Mark of the harassment that Julie experienced in the years before her death. Mark insisted that he was not the first person to send the racy images to Julie. However, he also admitted that he had held onto them and planted more X-rated photos around their home to upset Julie after she revealed to him that she had slept with her coworker, Perry Tarico. After spending 4 hours interviewing Mark, the detective realized there was no concrete evidence to incriminate him. Despite their belief that Mark had killed his wife to be with his girlfriend, Kelly, the detective and the district attorney were unable to prove the allegation. With no sufficient evidence to hold Mark any longer, the detective had no choice but to allow him to leave the police department. The lack of evidence left Mark free to go, but the detective and the district attorney remained convinced that he was responsible for Julie's death, despite the toxicology reports indicating that Julie was poisoned with ethylene glycol. The lack of proof implicating her husband, Mark, made it challenging to establish his involvement in the crime. Moreover, the absence of evidence proving his involvement in the suspicious internet searches involving substance and drug interactions further complicated the case. Despite receiving a statement from Julie addressed to the police department stating that if anything happened to her, her husband Mark was responsible, the district attorney was unsure about the admissibility of the letter in court. The defendant's right to cross-examine any witness providing evidence against them posed an additional challenge. Since Julie was no longer alive, she could neither testify nor be cross-examined by Mark. However, the district attorney argued that this limitation should be disregarded if Mark was responsible for Julie's absence from court, as he was the only one who killed her. As the district attorney spent several years trying to obtain Julie's letter pointing to her husband Mark if something were to happen to her as admissible evidence in court, Mark moved on and planned to marry his girlfriend Kelly. This revelation caused concern among the district attorney's team, as they feared Kelly would become the next victim. Recognizing the risk, the district attorney obtained an arrest warrant and charged Mark with first-degree murder. When Mark was arrested, he appeared shocked and was taken into police custody. However, he did not remain behind bars for long. Mark was able to post a $5 million cash bond securing his release. In the meantime, Mark continued moving forward with his life and married his longtime girlfriend Kelly, welcoming another child into their family. He also continued to raise his 2 sons with Julie. The detectives working on Julie's case and the district attorney were outraged by what they saw. They felt frustrated that Mark was seemingly moving on with his life as if Julie never existed. The ongoing legal battle for the admissibility of Julie's letter cast doubt on the progress in prosecuting Mark. Years went by as the state continued to have the letter admitted as evidence in court. Time seemed to stand still for both Mark and the district attorney's team as they awaited a crucial decision that could impact the fate of the case. After an agonizing 8 years of waiting for justice, a breakthrough finally came in the case of Julie's death. The witness, Ed Clubb, provided the missing piece of the puzzle that detectives and prosecutors had been desperately seeking. Ed, a colleague of Mark Jensen, came forward with the crucial evidence that corroborated Mark's involvement in Julie's death. According to Ed, the night prior to Julie's disappearance, he and Mark were out drinking at a hotel bar during their business trip. While Ed was expressing his struggles in his marriage, Mark unexpectedly inserted himself into the conversation. Mark openly expressed his hatred for his wife, Julie, and desire to kill her. Initially, Ed thought Mark was joking, but as he delved into the conversation, Mark revealed alarming details. He mentioned specific websites he had visited and poisons he intended to use to carry out his deadly plan. Ed Clubb, the witness, withheld his knowledge of Mark's threats for many years, fearing that he may have been overreacting. However, after hearing about the ongoing investigation and the lack of evidence, he felt compelled to come forward. He disclosed to detectives that he had harbored doubts as to whether Mark was serious about his homicidal intentions. After Ed's testimony, the judge took immediate action. Mark's bond was quadrupled, and he was promptly arrested and sent back to jail to await trial. Furthermore, the judge ruled that Julie's letter in which she implicated Mark as a suspect would be admissible in court. This crucial piece of evidence, shedding light on Mark's potential motive and threats, would play a vital role in strengthening the prosecution's case against him. On January 8, 2008, 9 years after the death of Julie, Mark stood trial. Mark's trial lasted 7 weeks, making it one of the longest in Wisconsin history. The jury deliberated for 8 days before finally returning a verdict of guilty and sentenced Mark to life in prison without parole. 13 years after his conviction, Mark continued to file appeals. Finally, in 2022, The appeals court ruled that the admission of Julie's letter into evidence should not have been allowed. This decision paved the way for Mark's retrial. Mark's second trial took place in February of 2023. Once again, the jury found him guilty, and the judge sentenced him to life in prison without parole.